Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, The 5 Most Common Job Search Mistakes and How to Fix Them, presented by Lily Marie Lamar, the Senior Career Advisor at Ivy Exec. My name is Rachel Lake, and it will be my pleasure to moderate today's session. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode, which means we can't hear or see you. However, we encourage you to participate in the GoToWebinar control panel. You can submit questions throughout the presentation beneath a corresponding tab, and then we'll do a formal Q&A session at the end. Second, we are recording today's session, and you'll receive a copy of the recording via email in the next day or two. So go ahead and keep an eye on your inbox. Now that we have those details taken care of, I'd like to introduce today's panelist. Lily Marie Lamar is a Senior Career Advisor with Ivy Exec, where she has helped thousands of professionals optimize their job search through one-on-one career consultations and resume critiques. Her collaborative approach leads to original and compelling employment documents that capture a candidate's expertise and unique value add. She considers herself to be a thinking partner, educator, and supportive listener who is committed to helping her clients achieve their professional ambitions. Lily Marie has dual master degrees from Columbia University in English and higher education. It's a pleasure to have you here, Lily Marie, and I'm excited to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the presentation off to you.
Rachel, thank you so much. And good morning, afternoon, middle of the night, wherever people may be today at this time. And, thank you so much for choosing to join us. And we know you could be doing any number of things on this Wednesday. And it's been a while since I had the pleasure of presenting to all of you. So I think it likely that many of you are probably new to our job search webinars since I last had a chance to speak with you on the subject. And so welcome, a very warm welcome to those I've spoken with, and to those I haven't. I look forward to doing so in the near future. Let's get started by talking about what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to go ahead and talk about what the 5 mistakes are and really break down each mistake and look at some practical suggestions for how to address it. We're going to give you a job search roadmap, and I like to think of that as a bit of a key takeaway that you might like to take a screenshot of or look back at once you get your recording sent over to you by Rachel. We're going to talk also about how Ivy Exec can further help in a little bit deeper dive after the webinar. So, and then we're going to end up with the Q&A. So, having covered all that, I'm going to hand the floor back over to Rachel here for a minute, and she is going to take you through our 3 polls. Rachel?
Thanks, Lily Marie. So I'm going to launch the first poll here. The question is, how many years of experience do you have? The first response is 1 to 10 years. The second response, B, is 11 to 15 years. And the third response is 16 to 20 years. And the final response is over 20 years. So I see some of you have submitted a chat to me, which is great. I love seeing that feature is working. But if you could go ahead and respond to the poll, then we'll be able to count that to see where everyone is at. So I'll give another 15 seconds or so for people to respond. Okay, so it looks like most of you have responded. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. And it looks like we have about 70% of the respondents said they have 20 years or more of experience. 20% of our audience members said that they have between 16 and 20 years. 8% said that they have between 11 and 15 years, and about 2% say that they have 1 to 10.
I see, actually fairly typical of our breakdown, but it helps me in tailoring. All right, thanks, Rachel. Second poll.
Okay. So the next question is, how recent was your last job search? The first response A, 1 year ago. Second response B, 2 to 5 years ago. Third response C, 6 to 10 years ago. And the final response is that this is your first real job search. Okay. So I'll give it another 5 seconds or so for people to respond. Obviously I know some of you are job searching right now, and we won't include that in this poll. That's going to be a follow-up question. So we'll just respond for the most recent time that you had a job search. Okay, so I'm closing the poll now, and here are the responses. It looks like 38% said that they last had to perform a job search 2 to 5 years ago. Then we have 27% for 1 year ago, 19% responded with 6 to 10 years ago, and about 16% of the respondents said that this is their first real job search.
So it's a real mix today. I see. Okay. Well, you all, each group out there knows that you're not alone. Okay. So our third and final poll.
Okay. So the last question is, how long have you been looking for a new job? Maybe you're just contemplating, have only submitted a couple of applications, just getting started. 1 to 6 months is the second response, 7 to 11 months is the third response, and then the fourth response is a year or longer. I'll just wait a couple more seconds for people to get their responses in. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in 5, 4, 3. Okay. So it looks like the majority of people have been looking for 1 to 6 months, about 47%, and 21% have been looking for 7 to 11 months. 17% have been here looking for 12 months or longer, and 15% are just getting started.
Thanks, Rachel, so much. So it sounds like a lot of folks are fairly recently into the job search, which is just as well, because this is hopefully coming at an optimal time for all of you who are. And for those who've been searching longer, this may give the chance for a bit of an about face or a redirect if that's needed. All right, so let's get into the mistakes. And let's start off with the first one, searching without a strategy. So it's interesting because I don't know if this is true for all of you out there, but I can tell you that in our culture, certainly the way that we're told to stay open. Never say never. Keep your options open. In job search, however, that's really the opposite of what makes sense. It would be the experience of going into a deli and just asking for a sandwich and not knowing what kind to order. You would be there for a really long time trying to figure it out, right? So if you go in knowing exactly what you're after, it's always much easier. Things are going to go hopefully faster and certainly a whole lot more smoothly. Now, this is not to say that you don't need to explore and that you don't need to think out what you want to do. Not everyone's going to know that going into a search. I realize that. Or what sometimes happens for some of us is we may go into the search thinking we want to do one thing, and then a couple months down the line saying, you know what, actually, no, this doesn't make sense, or no, this isn't realistic, or no, I actually am realizing I don't want to do more of that. I want to make a little bit of a switch. So this is why we always say that the search starts with your own wants and needs and goals, what you want to do more of. You have to remember also the importance of, and I'm going to quote one of our former coaches here, Laura Hill, on this, chasing the company, not the job. Once you get past that stage of exploring and figuring out what it is you do want to do, and we're going to talk a little more about that later, but once you get past that stage, you need to think about where you'd like to do this thing that you want to do more of. Okay, so what companies appeal to you? That may be based on a number of factors. It may be based on industry. It may be based on company size, for instance. And when we talk about, if we talk about environment, you know, we're talking about, do we want a flat hierarchy? Do we want someplace really fast paced? Do we want a lot of autonomy? You know, is collaboration important to us? Is customer success a value? What is it that matters to us? And, you know, how does that dictate where we want to be? And of course, your market and your what's available can dictate it as well. I realize that, but I would always say start out with what appeals to you. And of course, think about, you know, what problems are they having that you can solve. Now, talking about being realistic. Okay, once we've figured out what it is that you want to be doing and where it is that you want to go, you need to think in a realistic sense about, well, is this likely to actually work out? Is this a role that an employer is going to see me as a fit for? And to know that, you have to know your market very well. And a lot of that happens through networking. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. But one of the aspects of being realistic is simply years of experience. Let's say, you know, someone's asking for 3 to 5 years and you've got 15 years. They probably aren't looking for you, right? Let's say there are some skills that employers are seeking that you simply don't have. And these are crucial skills for completing the job. No matter how excellent your work is, it just isn't the right fit. So this is where realism comes in. And this is where we have to think about, well, do we need to make adjustments to our skill sets or to our ambitions for our next role? So a little bit on that. Now, let's talk about what it actually means to conduct a reactive versus a proactive search, because I know that this concept is fresh for a lot of people. We don't think of applying online as reactive. I mean, we're getting out there and doing something, right? It seems like that would be proactive, but in fact, not so much. If we are responding to something that already exists, as in a job posting, that's essentially reactive. Now, why is working with recruiters not something that we can count on? I've gotten on so many calls with a lot of folks who say, you know, can I find a recruiter to work with? Can I work with a recruiter? And I say, well, you know, a lot of you already know this because you've been on the flip side. I suspect many of you out there have hired people, but we cannot engage a recruiter as if a recruiter were a talent scout, because they're not. As most of us know, if we really stop to think about it, the job of a recruiter is to really focus on the needs of the companies who are paying him or her to source candidates for positions that they're looking to fill. So when we do get in touch with a recruiter, we need to remember that that is their job. That is the lens they are coming from. So no matter how helpful they would like to be, they can only do as much as fits in with what their mandate is. I'm actually thinking about a woman I know who is in the process of job searching. I was talking with her on Monday, and she works in financial services, and she was telling me about this recruiter whom she had met through another contact of hers on LinkedIn. And this woman was very nice and gracious and wanted to help her to get matched with the jobs in her organization, and told her to keep her informed and really tried to give her some guidance on what roles to look for. And that's really nice. I mean, what that signifies, and what all of you can do, and I invite all of you to try to do, is to build relationships if you meet recruiters who are potentially able to guide you into a role that makes sense for you. But we have to remember that it is relationship building, just like it would be with any other contact in our network. Now, with networking to generate our own leads, this is something that we have been talking just briefly about with recruiters, and we're going to talk more about in the next slide. But this is essentially what makes or breaks a job search. Are we generating our own leads or not? If we don't do that, we're just not being as proactive as we need to. So having said that, actually, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the second mistake, which I see more than almost anything else, not networking nearly enough or potentially not networking at all. So think about the way we invest for retirement, right? Think about the way we put money away. If we know we're going to retire at 65, let's say, it's not ideal to start saving at 63. So we need to plan further ahead than that. We need to be saving, let's say, at least 10, 15 years more ahead, ideally, right? Networking is very similar. This is why it doesn't optimally work to start networking once we've job searched or started our job search, but rather we want to get a little bit ahead of the curve and make networking a habitual part of our professional communications in life. And this is what we mean by saying, you can't wait until you need the network to create the network. The investment simply won't have time to pay off quickly. How do we make networking a habit versus a sort of an auxiliary step to applying online? It's actually simpler than a lot of people think. And I hear a lot of people say, oh no, I hate networking. I'm so uncomfortable with it. I think there's a lot of confusion, guys, out there around what networking actually is, what it means. I think a lot of people think of networking as transactional. I want something from you. I need something from you, or feeling like that's what it is to ask for help or to ask for a conversation. And ideally, it isn't. I mean, networking is essentially, if you can manage and build relationships, you can network. It's all about building collaborative relationships. So that's the most important thing to remember. If you don't have a contact at a company, this is why having that strong network in place helps you to build a new contacts out. You want to use the contacts you know to generate those that you don't know. It's so much easier if we can be introduced to somebody via someone who already is in our network. What's hard is when you have to generate a bunch of brand new contacts out of whole cloth at the last minute in the middle of a job search. Now, what does it mean? Okay, once you have this network and you're developing it and making good use of it, what does it mean to disempower your network? It's probably not something that people generally spend a lot of time thinking about. Essentially, it means that you're going to the network and not giving them enough tools to help you. One of our coaches, Renita Calhorn, a former colleague of mine, used this example of, if you were to ask your network, let's say, do you know anyone at INSEAD? And let's say the person you're asking, they're an alum of INSEAD, but they haven't really been there for a while, and they sort of say, well, I graduated in '93, I don't really know anyone anymore. However, if you ask something more specific, as in, do you know anyone in graduate admissions at INSEAD, it may be that sparks a memory or an idea in the person's head. It's the same thing if you go to someone and you say, I'm looking for a new job. Well, that leaves them way too much room for interpretation. The contact may assume that they know what you want to do because of what you're already doing, and that's not what you want to do. Or they may not understand the work you do, so they may steer you in the wrong direction. It's so much more useful if you can say, I'm looking for a CMO job at a young B2C company that has a product that is marketed globally, let's just say, for example. That's going to be much easier for the network to assist you with. And even if they don't have all the answers, they'll be able to brainstorm to help you come up with others you might talk to. Now, why is it not a great idea to rely on your current set of contacts alone? This is another thing where I've so often heard folks say, well, I talked to all my contacts and that's it, right? I've talked to everybody and, I've exhausted my network. I don't know what to do next. And then my response to that tends to be, well, that's fine. It's great you've talked with the contacts you have. And it sounds like you need to either, well, following up is always important, but you need to likely expand that conversation outwards. Unless you have a really robust network, this is definitely going to come up. You definitely will need to make new contacts who are relevant to where you're going. It's semi-unlikely, I think for a lot of you at least, that you're going to have contacts at all of your target companies. And ultimately you want to, especially let's say you're doing a global search. Let's say you're based in London and you're looking at jobs on the continent and in Australia, for example. You're probably going to, need to build out a few new people. New contacts, this is the other interesting thing about networking. New contacts often have ideas that our current ones do not. And it's a strange phenomenon. I think it's because, first of all, new contacts see you at your peak, right? They see you as who you are today versus, let's say, a long time close and trusted contact who is close to you, who might be great in terms of, writing you a recommendation or helping you think through and brainstorm your plans, but they might not be so good in terms of having fresh ideas that you haven't considered or of seeing you as the person you are now, right? Because they met you 10 years ago when you were 3 levels, below where you are at the moment. All right, so having talked a lot about networking here, let's make a shift and talk about our next mistake, which is the lack of a clear and concise pitch. The great thing about this slide is we have an example I want you to take a look at. Take a look at this pharma pitch, you guys, this few lines here. So there's a reason why this pitch is good. We chose this for a reason. Now I realize that if we're talking, actually, I'm going to take a step back here. I'm going to sort of define what I mean by a pitch. So obviously it's this little paragraph, but essentially an elevator pitch is something that we give verbally. It should send essentially the same message as our LinkedIn summary and as the summary on our resume, but when I think of an elevator pitch and the kind that you all will have to be giving, it's what we say to contacts old and new, and even partially in interviews about where we're going. So I realize if we're talking about, well, if we're giving our pitch verbally, we're not going to probably give the entire thing in the same breath, right? You're not going to rattle off this many lines all at once, probably not. It may be that in a conversation, which is what networking should be all about anyway, is one-on-one conversations, you end up spending 5 or 10 minutes really getting all this info out there. But this is a pitch is a great tool to use in answering the question of, tell me about yourself, or what are you looking to do? That's a very common question, especially in first round interviews, and you're going to need a pitch to do it. What makes a good pitch? Well, for one thing, it's avoiding this really, really common trap I see people fall into, which is where you essentially reel off your whole entire professional autobiography, telling everybody what where you graduated from back in 1998, and then what you've been doing since, and then how you relocated from Philadelphia to San Francisco, and then you change careers. And it's like, no, that's when people ask what you're doing, that's not quite what they're asking. What people need to know is the information like what we have in the example above. What is your value? What are you looking to do next? And what are some examples of how you've been doing that successfully? Do not tell people that you'd be happy to do pretty much anything at all. This is back to the example I gave you up front at the start of our webinar here of going into a deli and just saying, I want a sandwich. Well, we have no idea what sort of sandwich you want. I'm open to anything is about as confusing as it could possibly be. It also has a ring of desperation to it, like, please, I'll take anything, please help. And we want to get away from that. You are competent at what you're competent at. And most of us are good at doing a couple of things well, not more. Most of us don't have a suite of 10 or 15 things. And frankly, most of us have very few things that really are important to us in terms of what we want to do more of. So you need to be thinking about that when you tell people what you want to do. Having a specific job title is helpful. Having a specific type of industry, company, again, look at the pharma pitch above here, is really useful in guiding people to be of help. It's not about what we do, it's about what it is that we bring to the table. One of the things that I think we forget as job seekers, and this is true of everyone at some point, is that job searches are other-centric. Counterintuitively, they're not really about us, or at least not once we actually start making that search and talking to others. A job search is very much about how we can fill a niche. One of our coaches, Stacy Collins, he says, it's like we're a can opener. What kinds of cans do we open? Are we opening cans of olives or cranberry sauce, right? We need to be very specific about that. So what is it that you bring to the table? I'm thinking of someone I'm close with who was drafted into helping on a consulting project. And it wasn't his job to do it. He didn't have to do it. It was thoroughly just out of kindness that this person agreed to do it. But the reason he got drafted into helping was simply because the person who did that knew that he had experience in the field, and that was enough. And it was completely about the value that this person knew that he would add. And that's really a mark of being, of people knowing what it is that we're good at when we're called upon to do certain things. And that's ultimately why we get jobs. Let's see. So what is it that what problems do we solve? Are we, for example, do we save money for companies? Are we growing revenue? Are we increasing retention for, let's say, a B2C company with a membership base like this, right? Are we building out new offices globally, new branches globally? Are we launching a certain type of product in the healthcare space? What is it that we do especially well? How do we, and then in all that, how do we stand out in doing it? How do we do this differently and better than the average person? In other words, why do they want us doing it rather than someone else? And what are the components of our work? What are the combinations of experiences that led up to us doing what it is that we do? So all of this plays into our pitch and into our story as a whole. And we want to get where we're really, really specific when we talk about that. So having talked a lot about pitch, let's go ahead and segue out of the sort of the job search and talk a little bit about resumes and about some of the most common challenges that we all fall into with resumes, that what we've achieved versus whether or not that's on the page. Now, the first component of resumes for most people, and I'm going to say for anybody who has, let's say, more than 8 or 9, let's say 8+ years of experience, I can say, so almost all of you here, is going to be the executive summary. Now, executive summary, guys, it's a misnomer, and I wish I didn't have to use the word at all. I wish I could simply replace it with something else. I mean, essentially what a summary is a written down elevator pitch. And so the example that we gave above is very similar to what a summary ought to look like. We want to avoid saying anything that is inspecific. And this is, cliches, for example, would be things like, let me think of some of the most common ones here. Seasoned, driven, detail-oriented, even things like ethical and hardworking, things that are perhaps wonderful and certainly true, but things that are not specific to you or that could be interpreted many ways. We don't want to make big long lists of big long lists of skills or of the kinds of things that we've worked on. The summary should be very cohesive and very tight, and it should be a small paragraph. So let's think about your professional experience, having talked a lot about the summary and the pitch. This whole thing equals the evidence of what you've done, not your duties. So the summary has made a promise. If you hire me, I will do whatever it is, right? The bullet points in the experience then are the evidence of that promise. When we write about that, we need to provide a little bit of context so that people understand. So for example, if we've made a 50% increase in revenue over the past 5 years, maybe this was brand new in the history of the company, right? Maybe this was unheard of in the past 10 years. We need to give people a sense of why our achievements are important. Job descriptions are probably one of the least helpful guides in writing your bullet points. In fact, one of the things I often tell people when I see a resume that has a lot of job description, and this may sound a little radical, like, how could I possibly do this? But to simply take out a sheet of paper or your iPad or whatever you might like to use to make lists and simply write down the things we've done well. This is often the best way to get our achievements on the page. And then just delete the whole entire work experience section that we have on the resume, all that job description, just take it off the page at one fell swoop and replace it with what we've achieved. Now, I understand why for some people it's tempting not to focus on recent experience. Why? Well, because for some people it's not as relevant. Like, let's say the person is looking to make a transition back to something that he or she did in previous years. Sometimes, we don't feel that our recent achievements are all that great for some reason. That, we didn't achieve what we were hoping to. So we feel like, well, I don't really want to talk about it. Maybe it's embarrassing. Maybe it's simply not that interesting to us. But the fact is that no matter what it is we've been doing, we need to show that we are at our peak as performers. We don't, well, we end up getting sort of caught out if we make it look as if everything we did that was great was 5 or 10 years ago and now there's nothing left to say, right? We need to really focus in on what we've been doing recently. I had a client a few days ago who had worked at Bank of America before the crash in 08, and his achievements were pretty impressive, and his bullet points in his resume were actually very good, but they weren't obviously very recent, right? The ones in Bank of America were problematically long ago, and I said, well, you have to brush up this more current section of the resume, and his comment was, well, I don't know what to say. I've been working for smaller companies, I've been doing consulting, and I said, well, you have to think about what is impressive. It may be different, it may not be what you want to do more of, but think about, for example, how you've managed to do a good job in situations where there were a lot of challenges. Let's say the company folded and things, didn't get finished out. Let's say it was a much smaller company, so the metrics simply don't look as interesting. Well, you may have only increased revenue by $500,000 in X number of months, but if that is 60% of what the revenue was before, well, then that's actually quite a large increase, right? So we want us to frame our achievements in ways that serve us. We have to, I'm looking here, I'm thinking about the way we write about our experience. We have to spell it out for the reader. We have to make sure that the reader really understands. We have to be the ones to tell the story, connect the dots, rather than expecting that the reader is going to interpret by when they read the bullets. So metrics. This causes a lot of trouble as I know, for a lot of people. Not all of us have increased revenue, and I've been picking on revenue this afternoon, but that's not the only metric that makes sense. There are all kinds of metrics. First of all, we can save time. We can increase productivity. We can save the number of people working on something, right? We can increase retention. We can decrease costs, right? There's so many ways that metrics come in. So we want to make an earnest effort to think about what those metrics, in our case, actually are. Most of us have some kind of metric, even if we do what looks like a very qualitative job. I'd far rather someone make an approximation and say, doubled productivity, well, actually, that's not exactly an approximation, but let's say increased it by approximately 50%, or saved approximately 3 days on something, rather than giving us no estimate at all. Focus on how your work affects the bottom line. That is the real key in making sure that your bullet points work. Now, we do say that qualitative outcomes are of importance, and I would never disagree with with this idea of qualitative outcomes being important, or say that they were not. But I have to tell you, the more we really think about any outcome, the more we realize that there usually is a number behind it. So for example, a qualitative outcome, I'm thinking about relationship management. The qualitative outcome is that we build trust. But then the quantitative outcome is that we increase client retention, or that we have more return clients, or that, let's say, our reviews go up. We might go from a company that has 3 stars on Google to a company that has 4.5. And so our efforts, our warm and fuzzy relationship management efforts, contribute to that improvement. So having talked about quite extensively about that, let's take a look at our final mistake here, which is to fail to address employer needs. And this is one where I find people often asking, but how can I? So let's look at how that can happen. So creating your documentation, your LinkedIn, your resume, your profile of any kind, cover letter, anything, is a lot like if you've ever taken a public speaking class, ethos, pathos, and logos. When you write a speech, you have to think about, okay, is it relevant? Is it cogent? Will people be engaged by it on a feeling level? Will people understand it? And is it logical? Does it make sense? Does your argument or your position make sense? And resumes are a lot like that, because you are speaking on the page to an audience. Now, what does genericism look like? This is one of the ways in which we avoid addressing employer needs. So genericism can either be using the same exact document for every job, regardless of what that job is, and let's say we're applying to different jobs, or we're applying to the same type of job, let's say, but we're applying in different companies. So let's say that we're applying for a CMO job, but let's say that some of the companies we're looking at are, mid-sized financial services companies, and some of them are small technology startups. Well, you know what? You may be, and I realize this is unlikely somewhat to be looking at the same job in these different sizes of companies, but you may be looking at a CMO role in multiple sizes of company. But on the other hand, the ask that is made of you is going to be different. Or it may be a situation where you're applying for different jobs in the same type of company. In any case, you can't use the same resume because the ask will vary. The other kind of genericism is, the content and the messaging. So this is saying generic things about yourself that don't tell us very much. Back to my examples from earlier: driven, goal-oriented, results-oriented, talking about your duties, which, for example, any COO might have had to do, right? We don't learn anything about you if you're telling us things that are not specific to your own job. Now, what does it mean to customize a resume, and why on earth do we have to do this? Well, back to what I said, it needs to be other-centric, but also cover letters, and they're wonderful. I love cover letters because they give you a chance to really explain yourself, but oftentimes we just have to know this: they are not read. So the resume has a dual role. It's like it's a two-headed creature in a way. You have it telling your history and your story that way, and then you have it positioning and framing you. And that's why we have to customize it so very much. Your resume is much more likely to be glanced at, and if people don't like that, they're just not going to bother with the cover letter. It's just not going to happen. How do we do that? So there are a number of levels of customization. The only level in which you do not absolutely have to be networking is keywords. Keywords are actually easier than you would think to find. They are, contrary to what I think a lot of people believe, keywords are not a magic set of unknowns. Keywords are mostly skills and competencies. You can find them in the job description, and you can find the skills that others who do similar work are endorsed for on LinkedIn. And based on that, you can know what keywords you should be focusing on. But all these other things here, how the bullet points are ordered, what content to include, making sure that the language you use is appropriate to one type of role versus another, or one type of industry versus another, and knowing what you need to say for the use, for the sake of a particular role, really and truly requires some networking and some research into the company. Just applying online will never, ever give you this information. So this is why our conversations that are not necessarily about a specific job, but more about our career plans, are so important in focusing even the resume itself. All right, so we've gone through our 5 mistakes. Now let's take a look here at this job search roadmap. Remember, I promised you a takeaway, and I told you you may as well take a screenshot. Well, this next slide here is going to show you the roadmap. I won't go through every single one of these bullets because some of them are pretty straightforward, but just to clarify a few points, reverse engineering literally means what we started off with, which is what do you want to do more of? Believe it or not, that increases your staying power in a job. So it benefits you not only in terms of making you happy doing what you like, but also in terms of you just being productive. Pain points, this is back to what I said about being realistic. What is it that we have already, and what is it that we need in order to do the work we want to do? Do we maybe need to gain a few skills, take a related job before we get into the one we would like? What does that look like? Of course, I'm just looking here. What else I should comment on here? The companies you want to work for, it really does help to have a list of them. Let's say we have, well, 30, I would say, at the absolute outside. Sometimes that can be too many, really. Some of us may have as few as 10. It does depend, I will acknowledge, on what's available to us and where we are. But we definitely want to have somewhere between that 10 mark and that 30 mark. What does due diligence mean? Well, researching the company, talking to people who work there, building out contacts who work there, that sort of thing. All right. So having talked through all the components of the job search, I just want to remind you that we're here to help. Of course, we provide resume writing and coaching services, but the first step, and a step that I recommend to all of you, is to please feel free to schedule time to chat with one of us. We're 2 of us here who provide career advisement and support, and either of us would love to speak with you. And if you reach out, we will more than gladly get back to you by email, and we can set up a time to chat about your job search and your resume and how all those pieces fit together. So please feel free to write to us at careersupport@ivexec.com, subject line 5 mistakes, and based on that, we can consider having a conversation, and I hope to be speaking with many of you soon. Let me, though, hand the floor back to Rachel, and we can start taking a look at one of my favorite parts of this process, some of your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lily Marie. That was really informative, and we have a lot of great questions. So the first one, let me bring that up. Okay. So if someone has between 10 and 20 years of experience, how much of that experience should they include on their resume? And are there any restrictions on the number of pages you suggest they use?
Good question on both counts, very practical. So the general school of thought in terms of how much we should include is 10 to 15 years. I always like to say, come to a good stopping point. If a natural sort of break is 12 years, that's great. If a natural happens to be 16 and all of it is relevant, then I think there are times when that's justified, but definitely 10 to 15 pages, assuming you have 10 or more years of experience. Pretty strictly, we want to adhere to 2 pages and no more.
Okay, that's good to know. I like that hard, firm answer. Okay, so the next one, and I haven't heard this one before. So if you have a name that is foreign from a different country, should you put anything on your resume that indicates if you're a citizen of the United States, if you're open for relocation, any kind of information related to that?
This is a great question. I have heard this one before, a number of times. So those are two different. There are a couple aspects to that question. Certainly, if you are a citizen, or let's say you're authorized to work in the US, absolutely. I mean, it's not really about being a citizen. I guess what I would say it's about being authorized to work here. I wish truly that people did not have to put that on a resume. I don't think you should have to, but the reality is that I recommend you do, especially if, let's say, you are relocating here. I have to tell you, I'm not fine, and that's just because we don't want you to get, pushed out of a candidate pool based on some assumption that some employer makes that's inaccurate, fair or not. I'm not a fan of putting open to relocation. I don't know that it's negative, but it doesn't really address what's important to address, as in the employer still may be worried that they would need to cover relocation costs. I think the most important thing we can actually do is indicate that we kind of have one foot in the new location. If we know where we're searching, let's say we can use a local address. And if we don't, well, what I would say is then don't get into it too much. You'd also, though, I mean, sort of in keeping with that, it is no longer necessary to put an address on a resume. So what that means is that people don't have to know exactly where you are in the first place. And back to what we said earlier, right? If you're networking, the resume won't have to explain this all on its own.
Yeah, that's a great point. I just read a study from the Harvard Business Review recently that talked about I think you're 40% less likely to get hired if you have a commute that's an hour or longer, something to that effect, which is really interesting. So our following question, um, is it okay to include your graduation date? And is there anything you can do to kind of avoid ageism, being discriminated against if you're an older candidate?
Well, okay, again, two related but both very complete questions there, actually. So in terms of the piece about your graduation dates, this depends on when you graduated. If you graduated, let's say, in 2000, year 2000 or after. So let's say in the last, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to up that estimate. We're almost in 2020. I can't believe it, but so we are. Let's say if you graduated in 2005 or after, so most recent 15 years, I would recommend including it. We don't want people to assume that you are, well, I hate to say it, older than you are. Now, in terms of the whole ageism, that's a whole different conversation. We could spend a whole other webinar talking about that. And you know what? We have some really good webinars on our website. If you were to put in ageism on our search, in our search box, I wish we had a way of sending you the link actually to a couple of them. Anyway, we have some good webinars on that. But I will say that keeping the graduation date off is one way that some of our coaches feel can diminish the whole issue of ageism. But some of the other real quick tips on that, not putting 20, 25 years of experience, that's one way to again, minimize that a bit. And making sure your resume doesn't look dated. Simply making sure that it looks current, that your achievements are current, and that you understand what the market's really looking for. So we can't literally give you a magic vitamin to make you younger, but what we can do is make sure that you look like you're up with the times.
All right, thank you so much. And actually, I can send out that link, no problem. So I'll also include that in the next email, guys, if you want to take a look at that webinar. So the next question is about metrics. So appreciate the importance of including metrics on your resume, but what can you do if your project failed, or if you were only at a job for a short amount of time? You feel like you don't really have a lot of metrics to point to show your contributions to an organization.
This was exactly what I had in mind when we were talking about this subject earlier. So happy that you asked. Okay, so if you weren't at a job for long, what I would say there is sometimes there's just not a whole lot to say, and that is perfectly legitimate. Depends on how long we were there. Now, if we were only there 3 months, yeah, we're literally just not going to have a lot to talk about. We just, especially if we're relatively senior, the asks that we'd have on our plate, we wouldn't have had much time to achieve them. But in that situation, there are a couple options. You can either just put a couple of lines about the scope of your work. We didn't talk about scope in this webinar, but scope is essentially what you oversaw, what you were brought on to do, how many direct reports you had, your size of your budget. You can just focus on that and not have any bullets. But if you were there for a little bit longer, what I like to say is, even if you don't have many metrics, include those that you do have. Even if all you have is 1 or 2 bullets, we can see it's a short time and we can see that you were being intentional about trying to tell us something. The other issue, if your project failed, well, happens all the time, first of all. And with that, what I like to say is that, you know, just because your project failed does not mean you failed or that you don't deserve to take credit for what you did within that project. So maybe that project ultimately failed. Let's say maybe a product didn't launch, but maybe you still went a certain distance with it and you were able to take it to a certain level and get a certain amount of work done and it really improve some processes. Or maybe the company folded, but that doesn't mean that in your business development efforts you didn't generate some serious number of leads. So show the work that you did do and don't be attached to what happened that was bigger than you.
Okay, thank you so much. So our next question is about the LinkedIn profile. Do you have any suggestions for what to include in the summary section? And what advice do you have for someone who is kind of in stealth mode? They're looking for a job, but they don't want their current employer to see their activity.
So in terms of LinkedIn summary, and again, we could have a whole other webinar about LinkedIn, and we actually do. But the summary on LinkedIn should be relatively similar to the one on your resume. Now, LinkedIn gives you a little more bandwidth to tell a story, but you still want to be concise with that summary. Some kinds of roles, like let's say you're in a role where, let's say you're looking for relationship management or any role where you deal with customers and people quite a bit, you can be a little more colloquial. So for example, on a resume, we would say something like, you know, senior customer service executive. Well, on a LinkedIn summary, we might say, I am a senior level customer success professional, just paraphrasing. There was another component to that question, and I don't want to lose it. Oh my goodness, there was something else here, and my apologies, I'm forgetting.
So it's just about being in stealth mode while you're trying to navigate, the job search, and you don't want your current employer to know.
So there's not a perfect answer to this one, but what I would say is that if you have been networking all along, your activity on LinkedIn shouldn't be as dramatically different. But let's be realistic, since we were talking about realism earlier. If you haven't, as most of us tend not to, you are going to just be looking more active on LinkedIn, and I don't know that we can change that, or that frankly, that you should be too worried about that. You don't need to actually check the field that says that you're looking for jobs. That's one way to be a little bit stealthy. And I guess the other thing I would say is that if you're messaging your network privately, LinkedIn shouldn't be a place where the employer can look and go, okay, this person is obviously trying to get out of here.
All right, thank you. Do you have time for one or two more questions? Okay, great. So this person has been at the same company for over 20 years, and they're looking to transition to a smaller organization. And they want to help them grow, but they need to kind of overcome the stigma of the legacy employee, someone who has been with the same organization for so long that maybe they're having trouble making the leap.
Mm. So this is the kind of question where whomever you may be, I hope you will reach out for a call. This is one of the harder questions to answer without having a conversation, because why you're having a hard time is dependent on a few things. One may be your own sense of how, I mean, if you have, first of all, just to take a really big step back, you probably haven't had, well, you haven't had to job search in a while. So literally how to leave is part of this. And that's going to be one of the issues that you see yourself as a legacy employee. So how to change your kind of your own identity and talk to people who are outside your company about your work. I don't think, again, there's nothing we can do about the time you've spent someplace, but I think the main thing here is the story that you tell about why you are leaving. And that's what's going to make the difference between you seeming like someone who is just kind of in a rut and wouldn't know how to function if they were taken out of their, out of their comfort zone, versus someone who really knows where they want to go, knows what value they bring, and is very, very clear on why you want to move on.
Okay, so I think we'll close out. This will be the last question. What happens if you have many years of experience but you don't have a degree? How should you frame that on a resume or to a potential employer?
It's a wonderful question, and I've spoken with quite a number of people over the past 5 years who are in exactly that situation. So, okay, while we can't change the fact that we don't have a degree overnight, right? And probably it doesn't, in many cases, make sense for us to do so. What we should do is make it, well, first of all, we're going to be chosen based on our experience. And again, what I'm noticing here is, and that all of our questions that we've been addressing are about resumes. Now, again, the more you're networking and the more people know you and know your brand, the less whether you have a degree and check off that checkbox is going to steer your job search as a whole, right? You can't completely explain that on paper because there's nothing for you to exactly replace a degree with, unfortunately. However, you do want to show that you are I would say, a lifelong learner. So for example, have you taken some certifications recently? Or is that something you can do? Have you taken some LinkedIn learning classes? And can you have those? LinkedIn Learning gives you little badges that you can attach to your profile. Let's see, what else? Have you continued to learn new technologies? Have you continued to keep abreast of the market? Like, I don't know why I'm thinking about marketing so much today, but let's say you've stayed really abreast of digital marketing. So, we have people who have master's degrees who have not stayed very abreast of digital marketing, and those people, it comes back to haunt them, versus you, maybe you really have. And so you have this current sort of up to the minute quality that you can project, degree or no degree.
All right, thank you so much, Lily Marie. You've given us a lot of great information, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. Do you have any comments that you would like to end on?
I want to say thank you to all of you, Rachel, you and all of us here who coordinated this thing, and so very much to everyone out there for joining us. It is truly one of my favorite ways of connecting with all of you. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share, to answer your questions, and I hope that this has given you a good springboard for starting off or maybe tweaking your job search a bit. And I very much hope to speak with many, many of you in the coming weeks.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, Lily Marie, and thank you again to everyone who attended and submitted questions. Just as a reminder, if you would like to have a one-on-one consultation with Lily Marie, you can set that up. It's complimentary with uh, a membership. And so she can be very helpful. She'll take a look at your resume and then you'll get some individual feedback. Can make a huge difference. And then another thing I just wanted to remind everyone, we are going to send out a link with a recording of today's session. So you'll have access to the slides and to Lily Marie's lecture. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day.